So first of all, the Center of Competence on Humanitarian Negotiation was established now almost 10 years back under the leadership of the ICRC, and at that time its president Peter Maurer. And the idea was very much to create basically a space of critical reflection around the practice of humanitarian negotiation, and to do this through a partnership as opposed to, individual organizations. So very much also, how do we collaborate? How do we strengthen our each and everyone's resources and expertise? And so there is a strategic partnership currently between the ICRC, UNHCR, MSF, and WFP, who are really leading this initiative together. And so it's about reflection, it's about learning, it's about exchanges. It's all also what we hope to do with you today here in this webinar. So we have also been building a community of practice of humanitarian frontline negotiators, to which I think many of you are part of. And so here you just see a few numbers to give you a bit of a reality check of what this community is about. So it's basically colleagues like you who are based in today's most challenging field operation, who are negotiating on a daily basis, who care about their work, and who have a joint purpose that is around learning together and becoming better in their work as humanitarian negotiators. So we have the pleasure to have over 8,300 now colleagues from all the globe who have joined this community of practice. A lot of them, as you see here, the majority are also national, working for national organizations. There are more than 400 different organizations that are represented in the network, and also a very strong push to ensure we reach people who work very much into field operations, not just, capitals, etc., because we know that's the colleagues usually doing also some of the toughest negotiation to make sure we reach people in need. So that's just to give you a brief overview of who is part of this community. And for the colleagues today who are not yet, make sure if you're interested in the work of humanitarian negotiation, humanitarian diplomacy, reach out to us. We would be very happy to welcome you. And so why are we here today? We are here today because we created a series of webinars that is really around an issue that we kept hearing is a real true challenge for our colleagues on the ground, that is linked to what happens when flags change. What we mean by that is, how is the negotiation and humanitarian diplomacy environment evolving when there are significant changes in governments, regime, areas of control, or power shifting? How do we prepare for that? How do we anticipate? How does it impact the negotiation environment? So we've been discussing this topic for the last few weeks. And as you see here on the screen, there will be 6 different webinars on it. 3 already happened. The first one was around sanctions. So how do we negotiate on the ground in an environment where sanctions are imposed on some of the authorities or the groups? The second one was very much around what are the first practical steps we need to take as a humanitarian negotiator when those shifts happen. And the last one we did was around how do we try to maintain and build relationship in an environment where those flags change. And today we will really focus on another key element, which is around trust. How do we build trust in those environments, or how do we try to mitigate mistrust? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? What can we learn from practice? And so for that conversation, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Peter Maurer, that I know most of you already know, of course. Peter Maurer has a very significant career as a Swiss diplomat working for the Swiss Minister of Foreign Affairs. He has also been for a decade the president of the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross. And currently he's also the president of the CCHN Governing Board and the president of the board of the Basel Institute on Governance, and many other occupations that he's still part of. So it's a real pleasure to have you with us, Peter. Thank you so much for your time and accepting also to share so much of your experience. You have been on so many front lines in so many different capacities and talking to such a diversity of stakeholders. And I guess the beginning maybe of that conversation would be, can we actually, from your experience, can we actually build trust in crisis? Is this even possible? And if yes, from your experience, how can we achieve that?
Well, thanks a lot, Joël and colleagues. It's great to be back in a humanitarian negotiating setting, and really appreciate the opportunity. Let me maybe start with one or two very general statements. My experience is that trust building in crisis is a big challenge. It's not impossible. It is possible, and there are some basic recipes to do it. But it is also true that crises are most of the time indicators of trust falling apart between parties, and therefore something needs to be reconstituted. And also, I would say, once there is a solid amount of trust in relationship or between parties of a conflict rebuilt, then the crisis is most of the time over, because then we are out of crisis mode. So there is a strong link between crises, which are destructors of trust. By the way, not only crises are destructors of trust, but also failed attempts to get out of a crisis can mean loss of trust. And on the other side, it is obvious that trust is an interesting entry point as a concept to look at ways to get out of crisis situations. Now, you have mentioned, Joël, in your introduction, and CCHN is heavily about humanitarian frontline negotiations and about humanitarian diplomacy connecting to frontline negotiations. And I thought, in order to make it not too abstract, I do a generic example which is built on real life experience, which I briefly wanted just to summarize, and it opens what some of the aspects in crisis and trust building are. A couple of years ago, I tried to negotiate with the prime minister of a country in which we were active access to prisons. And access to prisons was easily granted in 8 of the 10 provinces, but not in 2 remaining provinces. And the prime minister always said, yeah, I agree with you. It's a good thing we want you to have, but it never materialized. And so I was looking for a private moment with the prime minister to ask what is behind after our second meeting and failed attempt to go and had to have access into prison. And it is in a private conversation, in a one-on-one conversation, when he flagged to me, look, I have a problem with a governor in that province. You want to have access. He has issues with the ICRC. He says that in previous times when the ICRC was active in his province, there was ill behavior by ICRC delegates. Confidentiality was not respected. Some of the instructions and basis queries of the was not respected. So it's an old story. While I have him somehow agreeing that it is in theory a good thing to have the ICRC visiting prisons, it's not acceptable for this governor at the present moment. And so I said, look, let me go back to the institution and see what the reading of what happened 2 or 3 years before in this province is. And unsurprisingly, this caused a lot of issues within the institutions. And I had to even as a president, you need to negotiate with your directors what kind of investigation you are doing into what happened in that province, and were there mistakes, and were there misunderstandings, or were there legitimate defenses of mandates that I should insist on when getting back to the prime minister. So we made quite an extensive review of what happened. Unsurprisingly, we found a couple of issues which were not according to the book, which were ill behaviors, which would confirm what the governor has said. And so I tried to get back to the prime minister with a sort of a differentiated response, re-explaining what the mandate is, re-explaining what our basic operational procedures are, but also acknowledging that the delegation at a certain moment may have made mistakes and deviations from internal codes of conduct, and that we should, while I would insist on going back to visit prisons, we should maintain a dialogue open. So if there is recurrence of these issues, that we address them immediately. So I spare you the details, but after another 1 or 2 rounds of in-detail discussions on these issues, I went back with a very transparent way of presenting our case. It has deblocked some of the issues, and prison visits started. So this is an example which tells you a little bit what issues are. When you are in a crisis situation, you have relational aspects in trust building, and you have institutional aspects. And you have evidence-based aspects, and you have perception issues. And you need to get to grips with those issues, and to clarify what is a misunderstanding and what is a mistake. You need to take a risk also to confront your own institution. Institutions never want to acknowledge mistakes. So if you want to move forward with your partners in a negotiation, you need to be able to have a differentiated view. You have somehow to combine relational aspects with transactional aspects. You have to negotiate with your counterparts modalities of reappointing delegates in the field, maybe what is normal, submitting the biographies of these delegates, ensure that there is trust in whom we send, that there is a mechanism to create that's transactional in finding the right ways of creating a common space. And then there is relational issues, because I had a good understanding, and I advanced my trust in the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister trust in me, that this relation would somehow be able to unblock something which both sides theoretically would appreciate, but not really in practice. So there is this kind of example I just wanted to illustrate, because it allows you to really capture a lot of aspects of trust building in crisis. I mean, one of the conclusions is also to always make distinctions in this complex relationship between trust building, between trust and interests of parties, between interest and norms and principles, and finally to look at behavior. And there is a interrelationship. It's like a sort of a biotope of trust building, where it is not only about trust, it is also about how you articulate your interest. What is an issue and a problem of interest statement? What is a problem of behavior? What is a problem of norms, where you come in demanding respect of norms? And I think there is complicated and complex and contextual relationships on which at the end you have a positive dynamic between those elements to find more trust in a crisis relationships, and there are more negative dynamics where mistrust is installing in that process, and you have a downward spiral on trust when you don't manage the equation of trust, interest, norms, behaviors well. And then, of course, Joël, but we can go then in details. There is kind of a little bit of a textbook then set of checklist that you have to respect when you really try to address. Now, I mean, it is about transparency, about walking the talk. It's about trust building has a communication aspect, but it has an action aspect. What do you do, which is seen by the other side and by your partner as a contribution to trust building. It's sometimes about explaining, because while we think that neutral and partial humanitarianism is a concept broadly embraced by parties to conflict, it's not really the case. You have to explain what it means in a concrete case. It's about a lot of aspects in which I can maybe talk a little bit later as well.
Thank you, Peter, for that introduction and this very concrete example. I think you mentioned really a couple of key points, and your example also illustrated, the importance, as you said, to go also beyond the formal meeting and try to find a space to understand what is behind the no we hear. And this is, I think, a situation we also hear a lot from the community when it comes to negotiation. You also mentioned, I think, how important the relational aspect is, but of course we cannot ignore that there is also a transactional one, and we have to find the compromises. I think your point also on what is a mistake and what is a misunderstanding is very key, especially again from a negotiation lens, understanding also and acknowledging when we made a mistake, as much as an organization or an individual, and that we cannot ignore it, especially when we're trying to build trust or at least mitigate mistrust. And so, yeah, I think also your last point, it's not only about trust, is a very important one, because it's true that, we all like to talk about trust. And of course, trust comes out as soon as you speak about relationship building, negotiation, diplomacy, especially now, I think, with all the division we see in the world today. Trust has become this, this ambition everybody has. But as you mentioned, it's not only trust, there are also interests, there are norms, there are behavior. So I think here, maybe as a follow-up point would be, how important at the end of the day is trust for negotiations on the ground, and can we actually negotiate without trust? What would be also your thinking around that?
Well, my thinking and also experience around this question is basically, I sometimes refer to trust as either the software of negotiation. It's the invisible good that needs to be there in order to make the machine run. You can also go more mechanical and old-fashioned and say it's the grease which makes the motor go round. Without grease, you can't start the engine, and without a software, you can't start the computer. It's kind of this invisible good, which is difficult to just think about negotiation without having a minimal element of trust. And if you don't, you normally can't advance, and that's where you need intermediaries who build minimal of trust beforehand, and who eventually look at the dynamics of mistrust to stop them, to contain them. So trust is an critically important good in negotiation. If there is no trust, but there is a big amount of common interest, you may nevertheless achieve some results in a negotiation. I suspect that between the United States and Russia at the present moment, there is not a ton amount of trust, but there are some common interests for different reasons. And when there are common interests and no trust, you can nevertheless arrive to some steps and to some conclusions. it's not that it is completely impossible, but in particular in crisis situation and at front lines in humanitarian context, I consider the sort of building of trust and management of mistrust, either directly or through neutral intermediary, critical. In humanitarian contexts also, let's not forget it's a multiple faceted issue in negotiations. In a negotiating context, you negotiate with your own side. Because when I remember well, my colleagues at ICRC were always nervous when I would go into a meeting to know whether I would stick to the text. So you have basically to build trust with your own people, that they trust you to go in a meeting and defend the viewpoint of the organization. And at the same time, you need some flexibility and some communication to inject, which builds trust with your interlocutor. So you negotiate with your inside, you negotiate with your partner at the table. You want to create a humanitarian space, access to populations, access to prisons, delivery of humanitarian services to people. So this is, and you need some common understanding, and common understanding builds on trust. That's important. So it's a multifaceted environment, and trust building is not an issue which is limited to a one-dimensional and back and forth issue on a negotiating table between 2 or 3 or 4 sides. It's the issue behind. And very frankly, some of the conversations I followed in your previous CCHN meetings around changing the flag reminded me also how difficult it is sometimes to build trust when external issues are influencing the way you are positioning yourself. You are seen as a representative of the international community, and the international community takes sanctions. So if you don't explain well and what your attitude to sanctions and humanitarian exemptions to sanctions is, you are perceived as a representative of the international community, which is looked at with mistrust, at least by the government and sometimes even by communities. So if you don't talk to certain issues because they are on a terrorism list, and these issues are at the same time, these people are seen as trustworthy people either by communities or by belligerents on a side, you are part of implicitly or explicitly implementing a vision of relationship, of society, which is not accepted by the other side. This is an origin of mistrust. Sometimes when I tried to overcome these issues, I was referring then to my diplomatic engagements in favor of generous exemptions to humanitarian goods delivery, or I could show that as a humanitarian organization, we have made their positions with the United Nations, with the European Union, with member states of these organizations, in order to have a credible, neutral, and impartial approach to humanitarianism. So my baseline is it is a critical issue. It's multidimensional. It needs to take into account external factors which are inhibitors to trust building and which we often discount.
Thank you, Peter, for that. And indeed, I think your point is very clear that it's difficult to start a negotiation, a humanitarian diplomacy effort, if there is no trust at all, and that it should be really part of our work, basically, to very much try to build that trust. And when we're not able to do it ourselves, how are we using other actors to support us to reach a minimum level of trust? Because as you say, usually you need it. Sometimes there is very strong common interest, but it might not be enough. And I think your last point also very important on we need to address the issues, right? So I think there are too many things maybe that we're trying to ignore, or difficult conversation that we are not having. But we have to be extremely aware on how we are being perceived and trying to address as much as we can upfront the perception issues we have. Thank you for
Maybe there
that.
is just, sorry to
Yes.
interrupt you, but one
No, no.
illustration I just wanted to illustrate. The fact that I personally and the ICRC insisted a lot on humanitarian exemptions and made depositions and brought evidence to the table of the harmful humanitarian impact of sanctions has, of course, given a lot of credibility, because when you do that with the United Nations, you know that take the Syrian case, that the Syrian regime will know that the president of the ICRC and the ICRC went to New York to speak in that sense. And so there was kind of trust building indirectly by engaging on generous humanitarian exemptions to sanctions. You are not anymore seen as just the voice of the international community, but with a credible concern about humanitarian impact. And because Russians and Chinese are sitting as well, and they get these depositions as well, they feed back to their allies. In this case of Syria, the Russians to the Syrian government, that maybe you should listen to and engage with ICRC and offer them something, because it's not contrary to your interest what they are doing.
Well, thank you for that, Peter, because it's again a very concrete example how trust is also about action and position, right? So it's beyond building relationships. So maybe now to move on, you have started to share a bit, by mentioning what is a bit the checklist. So from your experience with how important trust is, and especially maybe now if we try to zoom in an environment where there are where flags do change and there are big changes in power, what has helped you to build trust? You mentioned transparency. Do you have any other
Well, I would
concrete?
say a careful, what for me always was the most important is feedbacks from frontline on who are actors who are critical in order to govern a space and the population. And I have always maintained that one of the most important elements in trust building is to keep relation with everybody who counts, and to have an all-directional relationship. You may have afterwards limits what you can do, but as a humanitarian with a kind of neutral, impartial, independent mandate, you need to be able to talk to all sides. And I think that's absolutely critical. Communication explanation is important. As I mentioned beforehand, in an example, you have to clarify your position towards irritants with parties to a conflict. You have to clarify to one government why you go into non-government controlled areas. You have to clarify to non-government controlled areas why you are doing humanitarian services on the other side. You have to clarify your international position on some of the critical issue. I think one of the biggest trust builder was proximity to populations. It's an ambivalent issue, and you have to be careful how you play it. But you don't want to be seen in a humanitarian context as only servicing the government responsibility. You want to be close to communities. But when you become a credible voice of communities, it is reflecting also on your ability to negotiate humanitarian spaces, because belligerents will see that you are credible. Some of the negotiations have been always interesting. When you look, for instance, again at Donbass or Syria, where we managed to put hospitals and water distribution system near the front lines to create systems which would force both sides basically to cooperate. Water boards have been, in many of the conflicts in the Arab world, a critical trust-building institution. We work with water boards who know how the water distribution system works. We help water boards fix the distribution system, and we help them find an arrangement that they can continue to work. And this is of critical importance in community and trust building in a context, or supplying energy to one side or the other side. When you have these opportunities to somehow maintain a sense of normalcy in life, you can go to a hospital, whether you are this side or the other side. You can use water which flows both sides. These are concrete actions which create and maintain trust in community, or help it fix. And so this is important. Again, I mentioned transparency in terms of explaining. I think what is important is also to invest into long-term relationships, even if humanitarian work is short-term. But at the end of the day, you never know how the conflict turns, and the government one day will be the rebels the next day, and vice versa. This speaks a little bit to your change the flag template. In order to be a little bit provocative, I have always said humanitarians should never be taken by surprise because of changes. Because if you do your job at front lines, you know that things can happen, and you listen to what is happening, and you basically know that there is a potential that the luck of war and the dynamics of war and power will change. So better have good relations with the next potential rulers of a country. That was critical in the case of Afghanistan. We tried to maintain, during the whole period of international occupation of Afghanistan, we certainly tried to maintain relationships with the Taliban wherever they were, but also when we saw that eventually regimes would change, we intensified these relationships in order to negotiate a possible delivery of humanitarian services in Afghanistan under Taliban control. I mean, if you were not completely stoned, you would recognize a year before the Talibs took control of Afghanistan that most likely Afghanistan's regime will implode. So better do your job early on, because it pays into this long-term relationship building. So these are maybe just a couple of issues which I always thought are important. Maybe a last one, Joel, which I find complicated in today's environment. As I mentioned beforehand, there is a structural imbalance in the international community's humanitarian system, which makes it is in Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, it's in 49.182, that basically humanitarians are here to work with the respective governments. And and that's a structural and legal imbalance in the relationship, where you have to navigate a fine line of how can you work with both sides, because Article 3 also of the Geneva Convention allows you to work with all parties to a conflict, and at the same time respect the sovereignty imperatives which the international community has repeatedly stated on humanitarian affairs. That's a kind of a construction flaw which is inhibiting trust building, and you have to argue these cases through so that actors understand why you are complying with a system and at the same time trying to go out of a system as well. And so that's the delicacy. And maybe the very last point is, of course, I have grown up in a kind of sort still uncontested space of neutral humanitarianism. And we have seen in some of the context with the regime change in Syria, with the Ukrainian concern about neutral organizations, that in the heads of people, a neutral humanitarian can also be a danger to just sort of getting accused of being on the wrong side of history. When injustice has been made, you can't be neutral. That's the kind of political top line which also comes in situations. So today we are navigating between a legal setup which privileges governments, a second legal setup which allows humanitarians to work on both sides, and with some conflict in which we see a real big mix and confusion about neutrality as a humanitarian principle to secure a humanitarian space, and neutrality as indifference towards injustice. And these issues are not easy. I mean, it's a big bandwidth of tensions that you are managing, and it's not easy to do so.
Thank you very much, Peter, also for concluding on those kind of profound dilemma that I think are questioning the foundation of some of our, modus operandi principles, which, as you say, makes it quite challenging for colleagues in the field and ask us to also push some of the boundaries of our traditional narrative and find ways to explain that that fits the current environment. And so maybe we can take now a few questions, if you agree, Peter. And I will actually, the first one I will take is a bit linked to, I think, what you were just saying on those foundational principles. So the question comes from Rada, and it's around for the next generation of humanitarian diplomats, what principles would you emphasize or advise as kind of foundational to try to navigate those political rupture and rebuilding trust in contested spaces?
Well, it's of course a kind of $100 million question. My instinct, I would indirectly respond and say, maybe at the present moment, what we need is go back to the drawing board instead of looking at already stating certain new principles. I know that Hugo Slim is very strong. My dear friend Hugo Slim is very strong in trashing traditional principles and asking for new principles. But maybe we should think the other way around. What are practices which are still relevant, which are conducive to relationship building, to trust building, to allow access into humanitarian contexts? And and what are problems we need to work on. And I think having a kind of a bottom-up process will eventually lead to some new principle or to new definitions of traditional principles. As I illustrated with my last comments, I don't think we can continue just preaching the 7 or 4 or whatever principles of humanitarianism without expliciting what their problems are and what concerns we have, and eventually enlarging. The biggest issue, I think, on which, and rightly so, Hugo Slim has always insisted on is that we get to grips with the local humanitarianism and the relationship between local humanitarians and international humanitarians. It's, in terms of trust building, probably the most difficult conundrum within the humanitarian community, and which we still haven't seen an issue. Local is good if there is capacity to local, but how do we build capacity at local level? How do we build agency and leadership on local levels to which internationals can easily support and supplement? How do we do that change from a de facto international system and leadership on humanitarian sector into a locally led humanitarian system? We are all struggling with that. And it is inhibiting trust building within the sector, because still money is used as a de facto pressure point towards local agents. Local leadership is inhibited by lack of resources and capacities, and just filling up international documents who state the principle of local leadership doesn't make a change, because we have seen that since the humanitarian summit in Istanbul, basically nothing has happened in terms of a serious change of balance between international and local agency in humanitarianism. A lot of discussions, but not really a shift, neither in resources, maybe in skills and self-skilling of many of the locals. So my sense is, if there is a principle on which we have to work, then it's probably our understanding of local leadership in the future and what it means, and what is exactly the interaction between local and international.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. We have another question that is around, how do you establish trust with interlocutors that have a questionable track record?
Well, that's of course a good question. My sense is the question is always whether the track record is questionable because of untrustful behavior or of bad behavior. I mean, I tend to say we have to discount bad behavior as such. We need belligerents need to be talked to, and therefore you need to build trust with these belligerents. What you would hope is that you can find a level of conversation which allows you to do a little bit of the transparency and walk the talk, and what do you do till then, and what do I do till then? Do we have a common understanding of what needs to happen? So I don't think that a possible political judgment on a person's behavior is necessarily should lead us not to talk to that person. What you want to know is whether he keeps his word. And a lot of people who violate international humanitarian law are still able to keep their word if you manage to open a conversation. And so we need to make that difference. I had only problems with people who would lie to me or obviously and with no reason disrespect or move away from agreement. The rest is part of what we should be able as humanitarians to talk to all sides and engage and try to find hooks of communality, because this is at the end of the day essential when you want to do your basic job.